Okay, welcome everybody to the second of our fall 2024 Colloquium events. This event features Rachel. And Rachel, say your last name for me so I don't.
Caines.
Caines. Okay, it's exactly as it looks. Good. I'm glad I didn't mess it up. But before I introduce Rachel, let me share a little bit on behalf of the Veteran Studies Association that's sponsoring this event. My name is Corinne Hinton. I'm Secretary of the Veteran Studies Association. VSA, which you can find us online at veteranology.org, and we'll throw that in the chat, is an association that promotes and publishes rigorous scholarship about critical issues shaping veterans' experiences in any country and any historical era to enhance public understanding, teaching, service, and advocacy. You can find out more about the association online. You can become a member. We certainly encourage you to do that. You can also find links to our flagship journal, the Journal of Veteran Studies, as well as forthcoming information on any of our events, including our next big in-person event, the Veterans in Society Conference, which will be happening in 2026. So welcome to all of you and thank you. Let me introduce our featured speaker for today. Let's see. This is what happens when your email closes. There we go. Right. Rachel Caines is a historian at the Australian War Memorial and a PhD candidate at the Australian National University, living and working on, oh boy, Rachel, help me.
On a wall.
Thank you very much, land in
You're welcome.
Australia. Her research explores the experiences of first Australians defending country form from 1788 to present day, and the ways in which their service has been commemorated. She has an interest in the experiences of veterans and their communities after returning from war, with her PhD investigating Indigenous engagement with the soldier settlement schemes in interwar Australia. She is also interested in transnational histories of Indigenous military service with a focus on, please help me so that I don't mess it up.
Aotearoa.
New Zealand and
Maori and Pacifica.
Service. Thank you very much. Rachel has worked as a research assistant, tutor, and lecturer in the university sector, a researcher and fact checker for documentary producers, a museum assistant, and a tour guide. She has spoken widely at national and international conferences and is the author of several works of Indigenous military history. She also has appeared as a historical expert in the media and on podcasts. Since 2022, Rachel has worked in the Australian War Memorial's military history section. So without further ado, thank you, Rachel. Welcome, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Corinne. Thanks everyone for being here. I know that it's not bright and early for you, but where I am, it's a lovely, cheerful 8 a.m. It might storm outside, so hopefully the thunder will hold off for the next hour and a bit. I will just share my screen with you all. Beautiful. So today I'm going to be talking about the ways that we can use objects at the Australian War Memorial to tell some of the stories of Indigenous service during the Second World War within the Australian forces. I'd like to begin, as I always do when I give a presentation, by acknowledging and paying my respects to the elders of the land on which I live and work. For me, I'm privileged enough to live and work on beautiful Ngunnawal land here in Canberra, Australia's capital city. And I have a really strong connection with the land and also the elders and the community around us. I'd like to offer my respect to any Indigenous people or First Nations people of any background who are here today, and thank you for your presence. I'd also like to offer my acknowledgement and my gratitude to the Indigenous Australian warriors who fought to defend their country since time immemorial, and acknowledge that the Australian War Memorial has a really important role in telling these stories. So I was invited by Veteran Studies Association very kindly to give this talk following the recent publication of a journal article in the journal Genealogy. This was part of a special collection that was dedicated to discussing the ways ephemera, all shapes and sizes, can be used to tell war histories, particularly those from families and from communities that tend to be marginalised or absent from traditional written records. My article was shaped around exploring two main questions that take up a lot of my time at work. The first of those being, how can museums tell diverse stories of Indigenous Australian military service? And the second being, how can the objects that we already have in the Australian War Memorials National Collection facilitate or prompt this storytelling? So my presentation today will explore some of the collection items that I discussed in the article, as well as some objects that unfortunately had to be omitted from the final piece due to word restrictions. So I'm not just going to be reading the article word for word for you, don't worry. I am going to be engaging a little bit more broadly with the subject matter. So obviously a little plug, if you are interested after this in reading the article, it is available open access online and is relatively easy to find. Current research done by my colleagues and myself at the Australian War Memorial estimates that at least 4,000 Indigenous Australian men and women served in the Australian Armed Forces during the Second World War. We can only ever estimate, despite our best attempts at research, because race was never recorded officially in Australian service records. There was no box to tick to identify what background or what heritage you were, and a lot of the measures that were used by medical officials to try and designate people's races were based on very outdated assumptions and quasi-scientific methods that don't always ring true today. Despite restrictions that were in place to limit the service of Indigenous Australians, as well as their general movement and freedom outside the armed forces, many people attempted and successfully enlisted during the Second World War. Although we've identified around 3,500 to 4,000, we actually estimate that that number will probably be closer to around 7,000 once we bring together all of our final research. First Nations people across Australia also provided ancillary and labour support during the Second World War. And these numbers are even harder to identify, but are estimated to be around another 7,000 individuals. It's really important to note that when we at the Australian War Memorial discuss Indigenous Australian Second World War service, we're actually referring to 4 distinct groups. The first of those, and perhaps the one that springs to mind to you listening today, are Aboriginal Australians. So these are the original inhabitants of most of Australia and are split into around 250 language and nation groups across the country. Following the colonisation of Australia beginning in 1788, many of their numbers were dramatically depleted through warfare, cultural genocide, and other attempts to control and minimise the population. But from the South African War all the way through to the present day, Aboriginal Australians have enlisted and served with Australian military forces, and they make up the largest number within these 4 groups within the Australian forces in the Second World War. The next group are Torres Strait Islanders, who are the Indigenous Melanesian peoples who inhabit the Torres Strait Islands, which are a collection of islands between the very northern point of Queensland in Australia and the very southern tip of Indonesia and Papua New Guinea. These peoples are split into 5 distinct cultural groups based on geographical and cultural divisions, but tend to be recognised as a broader collective Torres Strait Islander group. And during the period that we're talking about, were governed by the same laws that governed Aboriginal people in Queensland. The next group, one of the smallest and also one of the hardest for us to identify, are Australian South Sea Islanders. The South Sea Islanders generally in Australia refer to people from throughout the South Pacific, both of Melanesian and Polynesian descent. But during the 19th century, there was a practice throughout the South Pacific that's known as blackbirding in Australia, which was essentially a slave trade, where people would be captured and kidnapped from their homes throughout the South Pacific and then taken across to Australia, to New Zealand, and to other countries in the area to provide forced indentured labour. Although this practice had ended by around 1901, and many South Sea Islanders were actually forced to leave Australia under the White Australia policies that followed, 2 large community groups of remaining descendants of these original blackbirded South Sea Islanders remained in Australia in Queensland and northern New South Wales. They're the hardest for us to identify because at the time they were not only governed under the Acts of Aboriginal Protection, but they also were typically not distinguished from being an Aboriginal Australian. So it takes a lot of genealogical work and work with communities for us to identify South Sea Islanders who serve. Although they are not Indigenous to Australia, from 1993, they've been recognised as a distinct cultural population within Australia, and in 1994 were identified by the United Nations Group for Indigenous Peoples as being an example of a displaced Indigenous population as a direct result of colonisation. Our final group, and perhaps the most surprising, are Papuans and New Guineans. Today commonly referred to just as Papuans, these are Melanesian Indigenous inhabitants of Western New Guinea, which is now under Indonesian control, and Papua New Guinea. The territory that is now Papua New Guinea was governed by Australia from 1919 through to 1975. And as such, many Papuans and New Guineans served with the Australian forces or were required to provide labour for the Australian and American forces in Papua and New Guinea. Many of these men who lost their lives are listed on the Australian War Memorial's Roll of Honour, which lists the names of all Australians who die while serving in overseas service with the Australian forces. And as a result, it's really important for us at the War Memorial to acknowledge not only the contribution of Papuans and New Guineans, which we'll discuss later in my paper, but also the fact that during the Second World War period, whether or not they liked it, they were considered to be Australians and were governed as such. These are the four groups that I'll be talking about when I talk about Indigenous Australian service, with the recognition that Papuans and New Guineans, as well as South Sea Islanders, were initially denied the right of whether or not they wanted to be considered Australian. The National Collection at the Australian War Memorial is the largest collection in Australia and also likely in the world of material and objects relating to Australian military service from the 19th century onwards. We have over 1 million objects in our collection, and these span photographs, artworks, heraldry and technology, including very large technological objects and very small examples of medals or shards of shrapnel or bullets, as well as large paper records, both official and unofficial. Our collection, like any museum or archive collection across the globe, faces issues in terms of collecting and displaying material related to smaller or minority groups. This is partially due to the lack of either contemporary records around their service or surviving records today, as well as a lack of access to materials, and as I've discussed, the difficulty in actually identifying people who belong to specific ethnic groups or otherwise. We also do a lot of work around diverse genders, diverse sexuality, and not only identifying people as belonging to these groups, but also in then connecting their stories to their objects that may be in the collection. We've been collecting for the Australian War Memorial since 1917, so many of our objects were donated before these were active concerns in the museum space. So the expansion and recataloguing of our collection to make sure we're identifying all of these connections is an ongoing process across all of our diverse records. Collection items, which can include photographs, medals, artworks, official documents, and also memorials themselves. The photo in the centre is of our beautiful For Our Country memorial, which is our memorial to Indigenous Australian military service on the grounds of the Australian War Memorial. All of these collection items can be really helpful in painting a diverse and nuanced picture of Australian experiences of the Second World War. And this is definitely true for Indigenous service, where individuals had vastly different experiences of the war depending on their heritage, the nature of their service and who they served with, and the location where they served. So today I'm going to be running through 3 individual stories of people who had vastly different experiences of the war to show the ways that objects, and perhaps objects that you would otherwise look past or were not really considered important enough to be in the memorial collection to begin with, are actually really significant in not only keeping these stories alive, but enabling us as museum practitioners to tell these stories to an audience and get some form of emotional and tangible connection. So the story I'm going to start with today is the story of Corporal Pat Sullivan and Aboriginal prisoners of war. So Edward Patrick Gordon Sullivan, who has always been known just as Pat, was a baker by trade, and he enlisted in the 2nd AIF, which is Australia's overseas army for the Second World War, in July 1940. He was actually one of 6 brothers to serve across the First and Second World War, and unfortunately, one of his brothers, Jack, did not survive the Second World War and was killed while fighting in the Pacific in 1941. After enlisting in the army, Pat was assigned to the 2nd 18th Battalion and arrived in the Malayan Peninsula by February 1941. Although the focus of Australian operations for the first part of the Second World War was in the Middle East, we did have increasing numbers of troops along the Malay Peninsula in modern-day Malaysia as well as in Singapore, just as a buffer in case the Japanese decided to attack. And this is exactly what happened. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, which I'm sure for this audience, I don't need to provide any further context for, the Japanese swept south through the Pacific. And between the 23rd of January and the 8th of March, all of the Allied controlled islands in the region fell under Japanese control. Between this period, more than 22,000 Australians were captured by the Japanese and became prisoners of war. Including this was when the stronghold of Singapore fell to the Japanese on the 15th of February, and around 80,000 British, Australian, Indian, and local troops became prisoners of war overnight. Pat was one of the thousands of Australians captured during the fall of Singapore, and he was imprisoned at the infamous Changi jail. He's one of 48 Indigenous Australian soldiers who have been identified by my fantastic colleague Garth O'Connell as being part of this initial prisoner of war of the Japanese, and he's been working to track their experiences during their imprisonment. Pat, as well as being a baker and an adept soldier, was an incredibly talented artist, and he filled an entire sketchbook that he brought away with him with drawings of his experiences in Malaya prior to his capture. He also sketched scenes onto envelopes, the backs of postcards, and really whatever pieces of paper he could get his hands on. These sketches and poems that accompany them reflect his sense of humour, which is a famous aspect of Australian military service, and they also show his experiences on service through his own lens. We're lucky enough that his entire sketchbook and many of the accompanying postcards and random pieces of paper are also part of our collection relating to Pat. And so we have the privilege of looking at his beautiful artwork and reading and viewing his war experience through his own eyes. Once Pat was imprisoned and his sketchbook was full, he looked for different artistic ways to keep up his spirits and to express his time overseas. A fellow prisoner of war taught him very basic embroidery stitches, and he and his fellow inmates sourced material and threads from what was available so that Pat could begin embroidering. He created 3 beautiful embroidery pieces during his time in Changi jail, all in 1942 after his capture. And he did so using gifted embroidery cottons, material from pay bags and from curtains found in an abandoned barracks. And he hid his precious needles in a beautiful makeshift bamboo holder so that the Japanese guards wouldn't find them and confiscate them. The first of the pieces that I have to show you is this incredible embroidered tablecloth. In the centre is the colourful Australian Rising Sun badge, which is the symbol of the Australian Army, and it's surrounded by scenery from Malaya, including an aircraft, Sepang, which are the little boats, and then obviously the words Malaya down the bottom, just in case we weren't sure where we were. The next piece is this incredible embroidered map, which is embroidered on a pay bag, which was used to pay the prisoners of war whilst they were imprisoned. He embroidered it with the colourful coat of arms of Australia, as well as the map, and then Australia's flags on either side. fellow prisoners throughout his time in Changi helped him hide his embroideries and tools from the Japanese, who absolutely would have tried to confiscate it and on several occasions were reported to be doing so. These embroidery pieces are especially significant because not only were they made during his imprisonment in Changi, which is famous for its horrendous conditions and high death rates, but they also survived Pat's journey to the Thai-Burma Railroad. So Japanese used many of their prisoners of war as forced labor to assist around over 100,000 Asian civilians in building a railroad between the capital of Thailand and the capital of Burma. This was a horrendous experience and is referred to by many Australians as the Death Railroad. Prisoners were forced to work up to 18-hour days and atrocious conditions. There was little food, little fresh water, poor sanitation, and disease was rife. Almost 3,000 Australian prisoners of war died whilst working on the Thai-Burma Railroad, as well as over 13,000 prisoners of war from other countries and more than 90,000 Asian civilians. So the fact that Pat, even in his awful conditions, kept his embroidery safe with him shows their significance to him and means that we are especially lucky to have them in our collection. The final piece of embroidery that Pat completed while he was in camp at Changi in 1942 is this cushion cover. Upon his survival and return to Australia, Pat was encouraged by his wife Emily to display his embroidery pieces at the local agricultural show in 1946. He did this and was awarded a special mention and highlighted in the local paper as being outstanding pieces in the needlework section, not only for his skilled embroidery, which was particularly impressive as he'd received no actual training in embroidery, but also for its connection to the prisoner of war experience and its survival. When the pieces were displayed, a small note accompanied them to provide some context for viewers. And it read, "These souvenirs went through the Burma-Thailand Railway, now known for its tremendous amount of deaths and hardship. All prisoners of war who saw this work greatly appreciated it, and the owner of these articles feels sure that without their aid in helping to conceal them when the Japanese made their searches, he would not be exhibiting them at our show today." The story of how Pat's incredible collection actually ended up being held by the Australian War Memorial is one that's still a little bit murky. We know that after Pat's death, a neighbour or a friend donated the objects to the Australian War Memorial. And although they include photographs of children, we're not entirely sure if they're of his descendants or of family friends. Pat's collection of ephemera is the largest collection in the Australian War Memorial relating to Indigenous Second World War service. Along with the sketchbook, the postcards, and the 3 embroidery pieces that I've shown you, it also includes his Bible filled with his own annotations and comments, a metal trinket box that he made for his wife, yellow plastic trench art rings, a handmade necklace, and photographs, as well as his bamboo needle holder. It's very rare for any collection belonging to a prisoner of war to survive long enough to return to Australia, let alone to come into a museum collection. The Japanese guards frequently confiscated materials from the men, and often due to the harsh nature and the frequent travelling that men were forced to endure, they couldn't keep personal items with them. So the fact that these objects survived to return home to Australia is really testament to their importance to Pat and reflects the broader role of art, creativity, and reading in keeping prisoner of war spirits up during harsh and sometimes insufferable conditions. This collection is also really helpful for us in storytelling because it reinforces and provides tangible connection to the fact that Indigenous servicemen were actively involved in one of the most famous aspects of the Australian Second World War experience, which is the imprisonment by the Japanese, both Changi and on the forced labour of the Thai-Burma Railroad. We're really lucky to have this amazing collection and the photographs that accompany it. And it's an incredible way for us to share the personal story and the personal views of one man who was part of a much broader Australian war experience. Moving away from Pat, and the standard Australian Army Second World War experience. And now I want to talk about civilian assistance to Australian and American forces in New Guinea through the lens of a woman named Margaru Gimelea Talabana. The fuzzy wuzzy angel stereotype is often how people in Australia remember and articulate the role of native Papuans during the military campaigns in Papua New Guinea during the Second World War. These men are often portrayed as unnamed aides serving their colonial masters, Australian or American, or as Papuan labourers who were helping to or as friendly and primitive people who had no idea of the true nature of the war going on around them and who were just happy to help where they could. Papuan labourers, such as those depicted in these photographs and artworks, helped carry supplies, manually lifted and helped wounded soldiers to safety, often along hazardous and dangerous paths, not only due to their natural danger, but also due to the presence of Japanese forces, and provided valuable guidance and assistance in the thick jungles of Papua and New Guinea. Work is increasingly being carried out by historians and communities to recognise the important role of Papuans in the Pacific War, and to acknowledge the fact that even during the war itself, Australian and American soldiers understood the importance of Papuan and local support for these campaigns. It's worth noting that the recognition of the importance of having the locals on side didn't stop the mistreatment of labourers at the hands of Australian or American soldiers, nor did it stop the coercion and bullying that often accompanied their labouring service. As we'll see, the true story of the Angels of Kokoda is far more complex and nuanced than we may believe. By April 1942, the Australian territories of Papua and New Guinea were under Australian military administration under what was called ANYAU, or the Australian New Guinea Administrative Unit. Most of the island fell under Japanese control by mid-1942, and more Australian troops arrived from the Middle East and from the mainland of Australia to help defend the last small stretch of territory that protected Australia from Japan. About 150 kilometres separates the south of New Guinea from the top of Australia, and mostly it's the Torres Strait Islands and a collection of other islands and straits that separate the two countries. Papuans and New Guineans, who had been under Australian legislative control from 1919, were expected to remain loyal to Australia regardless of invasion, although villagers were given no instructions on what to do if the Japanese did invade, and were given no warnings or time to evacuate ahead of the Japanese army or navy. In areas under Japanese control, the Japanese expected the locals to support their war effort and went so far as recruiting and placing local kempeitai, or secret police agents, in villages to ensure compliance. This led to a real tension. Papuans and New Guineans were expected to help the Allied forces, and many wished to or were forced to, but they faced execution and the torture of themselves or their families if they were caught doing so by the Japanese. At the same time, locals caught by the Allies helping the Japanese were also punished for their crimes. In 1903, and perhaps what is the most famous case, 34 Orokiva from New Guinea were executed for treason after helping Japanese forces following their invasion. They were viewed to have betrayed the Allied missionaries and servicemen they were supposed to help. And this, at the time and more recently, has led to questions over whether or not Papuans and New Guineans, colonised peoples with little understanding of Australian expectations, should have been governed under Australian treason laws, and whether or not this should have happened. So Papuans and New Guineans living under Japanese occupation and in combat zones were faced with a really difficult decision. And many Papuans were conscripted into service, either through propaganda, false promises about what they would receive in return, or straight up bullying by Anyao officials desperate for help, and often faced harsh punishments for desertion, slow work, or even just without justification on the whims of commanding officers. Despite all of these complications, the importance of Papuans to the war effort was recognised by both Australian and American military commanders. Allied servicemen from both countries were explicitly instructed to remain on good terms with local populations, albeit through a paternalistic gaze informed by outdated racial stereotypes and colonial values. Booklets, such as the one on the screen, were supplied to Allied troops with instructions on exactly how to interact with locals, including the importance of them as potential allies and how to ensure their loyalty. The guidebook on the screen from 1943 began with the section titled Our Potential Allies. And it read, "The natives are a very important factor in the military situation. Their goodwill may decide whether we win or lose the Battle of New Guinea. Remember that the natives are our real or potential allies. Keep on the right side of them." These guidebooks provided instructions on how to behave towards the locals, proper behaviour within villages and on missions, and how best to avoid altercations and confrontations with hostile natives they may come across. One of the most important ways for maintaining local loyalty, it was viewed, was the bartering of trinkets and items in exchange for food, shelter, safety, and guidance. This was built into instructions for Australian service personnel and tied to both the importance of goods within traditional Papua New Guinean society, as well as the fact that villages faced ongoing supply shortages. And it was connected, although well-meaning, to the infantilization of local populations and the belief of the Allied forces in a paternalistic and colonial role. Airmen were often issued kits, like you can see on the screen, of small trinkets and sewing supplies. These were to be used in case of a crash landing or a landing in hostile territory to barter in exchange for food, lodging, transportation, and guidance away from enemy territory and to Allied bases. These guidebooks and trading kits emphasised the importance of maintaining positive relationships with local Papuans and New Guineans for not only the overall war effort, but also many times for the survival of individual servicemen left in unexpected and dangerous situations. Another way that the Australian forces tried to connect with local populations and win their support was through loyal service medals, which you can see on the screen. These were introduced in 1942 and were specifically designed to be presented to Papuan and New Guinean civilians who, on their own goodwill, assisted in the Allied war effort. They were presented by Anyao officials to local civilians, often at large ceremonies that combine traditional culture and Australian military pomp. It's important to note that these are not official military medals. They're more akin to medallions that were used as a show of gratitude rather than conveying any military honour upon those civilians. The medallion would be inscribed with the name of the awardee and presented to them in their large ceremonies, recognising that often the assistance that was provided was done at great personal risk to the individual and their community. The memorial holds two of these medallions. One is on display in our Second World War gallery and the other is safely within our collection. Neither of them are engraved, so it's likely that they were never awarded during the war and were backstops that were left over and donated to the memorial as a sample type. Some of the stories of the individuals who were awarded these medallions were not recorded and are very difficult to recover from current historical records. But some do survive, and it's one of those that I want to talk about now. One story that survives is that of Meguru Talabono, who's the only woman in the photograph on the screen. She was one of 6 New Guineans who was awarded one of the medals for loyal service in April 1943 at Ahioma, New Guinea. All of the medals were awarded for assistance provided by civilians during the Battle of Milne Bay, one of the most famous battles in the New Guinea campaign in the Second World War. Luckily for the memorial, the ceremony was photographed by a photographer on the ground, Norman Brown. And this means that the photographs survive and give us a glimpse into the ceremony itself and a way for us to recover the stories of those who were photographed and rewarded. During the Battle of Milne Bay, leading aircraftman John Donegan was severely wounded when his RAF crash boat attempted to leave Milne Bay and was sunk by Japanese light caliber shell fire. After floating for 18 hours in the water, injured and without help, he was rescued by men from the nearby Davana village and brought back to their shelter. Although the village was in an area under Japanese control, the men didn't hand over Donegan to the Japanese forces. Instead, he was brought into a hut where he was nursed back to health by Meguru. Meguru was a mission-trained nurse, but also experienced in traditional medicine, and used both of the two to help Donegan's wounds and get him to a position where he was healthy enough to be moved. While Donegan was recovering, villagers crossed Milne Bay to inform the Allies that he had survived and to expect that he would be transported to their base at Gilly Gilly as soon as he was able. This occurred on the 12th of September, and he was then evacuated to the mainland for final medical treatment before returning. All of the villagers involved in the assistance, but particularly Meguru, risked torture and execution if they were discovered in assisting Donegan. And this was well recognised by the Australian forces. Donegan himself had promised Meguru, who he referred to as Nurse Madura, a promise of rewards of goods to thank her for her assistance for him. And these goods were listed in his casualty report, so we know exactly what they were. He promised her a bicycle, a raincoat, a pair of spectacles, a box of aspirin, 7 yards of dress material of her choosing, and a sweater. The Air Force considered it essential that these articles be provided to Meguru as promised in order to reward her for her assistance and to make sure that the local population continued to help Allied servicemen in times such as this. As well as the material goods, which were presented to her in an informal presentation by local RAF men in early 1943, once the area returned to Allied control, Meguru was also presented with a Loyal Service Medal for her outstanding service to the Allied war effort in April 1943. This is just one example of the ways that Papuan and New Guinean civilians, often at great risk to themselves, assisted the Allied war effort without expectation of reward or payment. Papuan and New Guinean labours and support were vital to the Allied war effort and was recognised as such by Allied officials throughout their time in Papua and New Guinea. While many labourers and ancillary workers were conscripted or forced into their positions, often receiving no pay and harsh treatment from the Allies and the Japanese if captured, some civilians did voluntarily help the Allied forces, often at great personal risk to themselves. Although we've been able to capture some of these stories, such as the story of Meguru, what is missing is her own words and her own explanation for why she chose to help the wounded Allied servicemen. These were not recorded at the time, and as the survivors of the Second World War die and their descendants become older, it's often difficult for us to capture their experiences even through subsequent oral histories. As a further reflection of the gratitude of the Australian government towards Papuans and New Guineans, Fuzzy Wuzzy commemorative medallions, as they were called, were awarded to some of the surviving labourers in 2009 by the Australian government. And in both their form and the way they were presented, echoed the Loyal Service medallions awarded during the Pacific Campaign. They held no military significance and no entitlement to pensions or other veteran benefits, but were a token of the gratitude of the Australian government and the Australian people, still wrapped up in a colonial expectation and understanding of the relationship between Papua New Guinea and Australia. Objects such as these loyal service medallions, trading kits, and handbooks, along with the photographs and artworks that have made their way into the memorials collection, help us to tell what is a really nuanced story of the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels. And it complicates narratives of both the willing, naive Papuan assistant and the forced and bullied native labourer. Take a quick drink of water. The final story that I want to tell today is that of Lance Corporal Saulo Waia and the Torres Strait Light Infantry Battalion. Unlike in the United States, where segregated battalions were very common, the majority of enlisted Indigenous Australians served in unsegregated battalions and units in both the First and Second World War. From 1942, however, a small number of segregated units were formed to support the Australian Army. These were typically auxiliary units, combining traditional Indigenous knowledges with basic military training as a way to retain the loyalty and service of communities viewed to be on the fringe and take advantage of populations in the otherwise scarcely populated Northern Australia, which is viewed to be the most at risk from Japanese attack. These handful of segregated units that were formed across Northern Australia played a central role in contributing not only to the defence of Australia, but also the broader Allied war effort. The three largest of these units were the Northern Territory Special Reconnaissance Unit, which was formed from 1942 to 1943 from men in the Arnhem Land area of Australia, the Snake Bay Patrol, which was formed on one of the islands near the Torres Strait in 1942, and the Torres Strait Light Infantry Battalion, which was active from 1941 to 1946. The Torres Strait Light Infantry Battalion was the largest Indigenous specific unit raised in Australia during the war, and it was the only one of these special units to reach the strength and designation of a full battalion. It had maximum strength of 830 men, mostly from the Torres Strait, led by white military officials. The Torres Strait Light Infantry Battalion had the highest community participation rate of the war in Australia. Almost all eligible men from the Torres Strait Islands enlisted and served within the Torres Strait Light Infantry Battalion. Testimonies from the men who served describe a mixture of an active willingness to serve and a desire to protect their home from invasion, alongside aggressive recruiting practices on behalf of the Australian military officials that in many ways mirrored previous colonial violence in the region, as well as false promises and coercion. Initially formed as an independent infantry company in May 1941, the unit was expanded and established officially as a battalion by March of 1943. Men received combat training and undertook manual labour, wireless operating, driving, signalling, and carpentry work alongside basic defence and patrols. The men of the Torres Strait Light Infantry Battalion were paid less than their white counterparts, even after a strike in 1943 for improved treatment and conditions led to a slight increase in their pay. While they mostly served within the Torres Strait and Northern Australia, in late 1943, a detachment carried out patrol operations in New Guinea and engaged with Japanese forces there. And in 1944 and 1945, a small detachment was based in Merauke, Papua, under the command of Major Charles Godstall. The final object that I'm going to talk about in detail today comes from that period of time in Papua serving under Godstall. Saulo Waia was one of 7 brothers to enlist in the Torres Strait Light Infantry Battalion and was one of the men who accompanied Godstall to Papua in 1944. At Christmas, Fitting in with the tradition of the Australian forces, the men were served dinner by their commanding officers. And after the dinner, Saulo was presented with a present from Major Gottschalk's wife, Doreen. Following Christmas, Saulo wrote a letter of thanks to Doreen, expressing thanks for her present and the fact that she was thinking of him, and promising that he was looking after Baba Gottschalk for her. This letter is significant for a number of reasons. Firstly, that Saulo was writing to the officer, to the wife of his commanding officer, who in return had gifted him a Christmas present. But the most significant part of this letter is that it's written in Colloquium, which is the traditional language of Saulo's native Sabai Island. Letters written by Indigenous Australian servicemen from both World Wars are very rare and hard to find. But letters written in traditional languages are almost impossible. This handwritten letter not only survives, but was hand translated by Gottschalk himself, which you can see on the screen comparing the two letters. This letter was lost to all of us for a very long time, but was discovered ahead of a 2017 exhibition at the Australian War Memorial focusing on Indigenous military service within the personal papers of Charles Gottschalk, which were donated to the memorial after his death. Not only does this letter show the survival of a dying language in both spoken and written form into the 1940s, but it also shows Gottschalk's familiarity with the language and his connection to the men, as he was able to translate the letter himself. In other documents found in the papers where we found these letters, Gottschalk also described the men of the Torres Strait Light Infantry Battalion as proud, splendid seamen and precision itself. While there's no denying that there was still a paternalistic and colonial lens that impacted the relationship between the commanding officer and his men, Baba, which is how Saulo refers to Charles, is a Papuan and Torres Strait Islander diminutive of dad, and it's, even though it is the friendly form, it still shows that paternalistic relationship. But clearly the letters, both in original form and in translation, were important enough for Doreen and Charles to keep and to include in the donated papers that reached the Australian War Memorial. It's a real privilege for us to have Saulo's own writing and language in the collection, as many of the personal reflections of men serving in the Torres Strait Light Infantry Battalion weren't captured until interviews in the 1990s, many years after their service. Objects more broadly that relate to the Torres Strait Light Infantry Battalion are rare within our collection. They're mostly photographs taken by white photographers or relating to the white commanding officers in charge of the battalion. These letters demonstrate Saulo's strong cultural connection to home and his relationship to his history and heritage that was shared by other men in the Torres Strait Light Infantry Battalion, and often given as their reason for enlisting, that they were proud of their home and they wanted to defend their otherwise defenseless home against invasion. The memorial is lucky enough that we also hold oral history from Saulo, which was recorded in the 1990s. Combined with the letters and the photographs that we have of him and his brothers serving, these collection items all provide an insight into the life in the Torres Strait Light Infantry Battalion, which was a unique battalion in the Second World War. It is important to note that men from the Torres Strait Light Infantry Battalion did not receive their full back pay or their service medals until the 1980s, and historians and communities are still working to recover this service and ensure that it's given its full attention. This is a significant, unique, and lesser known part of Australia's Second World War history and even Indigenous Australian service in the Second World War. And through Saulo's letter and his collection and photographs, it's a really great way for us to engage members of the public in what is a really important story for Australia. So we're talking about storied objects, the name of my presentation. Objects alone obviously don't tell stories. They need interpretation from communities, from individuals, and from museum professionals. But in many ways, objects, and even these objects that otherwise may seem innocuous, are central to the way museums curate and disseminate war stories to the public. Tangible objects are often easiest for visitors to connect with and create an emotional connection to personal stories that otherwise may have been forgotten or overlooked, particularly within documentary records that tend to prioritize the majority white experience. There are plenty of other objects in our collection relating to the Second World War service of Indigenous Australians. Some of those include the uniform, membership badge, flying book, and photographs of Flight Lieutenant David Valentine Paul, who was a New South Wales Aboriginal Australian man who trained in Rhodesia with the Empire Air Training Scheme and went on to be awarded a Distinguished Flying Conduct Medal for his service, was shot down over the Greek islands in December 1943 and spent the rest of the war imprisoned in the German Stalag 4B concentration and prison camp. After the war, David went on to serve with the New South Wales Police Force and was promoted to squadron leader within the Royal Australian Air Force Reserves. We also have a Palestine Pound postcard, which belonged to South Sea Islander soldier Private William Bill Inez. These were really common as souvenirs and were a Palestine pound, so old form of currency, that you could have your photograph and the photograph of a loved one included, where there would usually be pictures of significant landmarks in the Middle East. This is one of the few objects that we have relating to Australian South Sea Islander service in the Second World War. Aside from photographs, we don't have many collection items. We also have an amazing carved cigarette case, which belonged to Captain Reg Saunders, who was for a long time believed to be the only Aboriginal commissioned officer from the World Wars, and is a very significant Australian military figure. Reg served in both the Second World War and the Korean War, and went on to be awarded a member of the British Empire in 1971 for his services helping Indigenous Australian communities, and became the first Indigenous Australian member of the War Memorials Council prior to his death. This cigarette case, which is scratched into and carved, records all of the places he saw service in the Middle East and Africa during the Second World War, and is an incredible story of not only his service, but also the ways that he treated his objects and viewed. Reg is a Gunditjmara man from Western Victoria in Australia, and was widely outspoken about the service of not only his forebearers in the First World War, but also their role in fighting against colonisation in the early colonisation of Victoria in the 1800s. All of these objects and many more help us tell these diverse stories of Indigenous service. Each is connected to a personal story and a personal experience of war. Not all of these objects are on display in our collection. When we have a collection of over 1 million items, we obviously can't put them all in the galleries. But there are other ways to help connect people to the objects and the stories that they're associated with. Often they're available online digitally through the War Memorials website, enabling people to explore the objects and the stories in greater detail. And then obviously through talks like this, we're able to share items in the collection that otherwise don't see the light of day and show how they connect to these broader stories of service. There are obviously objects and stories that are missing from our collection and that may be harder to tell. We have very few items in the collection relating to Indigenous women's war service, beyond a handful of photographs and recorded oral histories after the fact. Also, there's a dearth of objects from naval stories and naval service, so we're still working to capture the experiences of Indigenous service in the Royal Australian Navy. And the stories of ancillary labourers, those who were unenlisted and often unpaid, but provided vital war work. Very few items related to them were collected because they weren't viewed to be part of the war effort, despite their valuable contribution. These are gaps that we've recognised in the collection. and we're doing our best to fill them over time through donations and purchasing through auctions as they come up. But the memorial understands our important role as the holders of these significant objects that may also be imbued with additional cultural significance from the communities that they're associated. Objects in our collection give us insight into only a handful of thousands of Indigenous Second World War stories, but they do go some way into explaining the depth and diversity of Indigenous experiences of the Second World War. Uncovering and sharing these stories and the way they relate to objects in our collection is a really important part of diversifying our understanding of the Australian Second World War experience and the Second World War more broadly. And it opens up more questions for both local and international audiences about not only their relationship with the Australian forces and Indigenous Australian servicemen, but also minority groups within their own armed forces. In Australia, collecting, discussing, and sharing these stories is also a really important way that the memorial can contribute towards greater reconciliation, recognition, and equality for Indigenous service people who gave so much to Australia. And I'd really like to end on a quote from my colleague, Mr. Michael Bell, who is the Indigenous Liaison Officer at the Australian War Memorial, because I think he summarises this the best. Researching the commitment and contribution of Indigenous Australian service people has revealed the depth and diversity of this service, just as their service is a reflection of the diversity of the ancient and modern societies from which these men and women came. The shared experience of war and the recognition of patriotism, loyalty, love, service, and sacrifice can be a step towards greater reconciliation. And I'm very proud to be playing a small part in that. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure to talk to you all.
Thank you, Rachel. That was fantastic. I know I have a couple of questions, but I will hold off and open the floor. You can type it in the chat if you can't or don't wish to unmute yourself. Otherwise, feel free to jump in. Wanda.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you do any comparison to the United States and the minority efforts around service people during the same time period?
I've done a little bit of work on the United States. It's a little bit out of what I originally looked at, but I'm very interested in the experience in the United States, both of African American service people, but also of the role of Native Americans in the war service. And so that's an area that I'm starting to do more comparative work in, and hopefully we'll get more out of that as it comes in. I've definitely done more for the First World War than I have for the Second World War, but it's absolutely something that I'm interested in pursuing in more detail and learning more about.
Thank you so much.
I would like to add on to that. My dad and my uncles, they're US Navy and Marine veterans. And one of my goals in the future would to like build schools and have our information that's put into schools, and all schools are real information about like US history, because I know growing up and studying the US history that we had in our books at that time, and I'm pretty sure it's still they're still distributing the same information, was that like I wasn't interested because I knew there were lies and things like that. So I want to change our youth's future and educate educate them with real information and experiences from real war leaders and real peacemakers, of like stories of their point of view and things like that. So I'm working on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so important. We have the same in Australia. A lot of our education for a very long time has fit into a very narrow view, particularly in relation to the First and Second World War. Yeah. And it's a real privilege to be doing some of the work to help, as you've said, bring those stories of real leaders and real peacemakers to light. So I think it's very important work you're doing.
Very cool. Thank you. Thank you.
So Rachel, you talked a little bit about the high enlistment of the folks who ended up serving in the Torres Strait Light Infantry Battalion. And I'm wondering if what you believe is credit for that is predominantly the people of that region who, as you said, had that sort of homeland connection and the desire to protect, or if there were any other indicators of the value of that region or some external forces that might have resulted in that particular group being such a high enlisted population.
I think it's a great question. I think one of the main reasons for the high enlistment is that connection to the community, the connection to home. And also we see across Indigenous service more broadly that kinship and family connections are a major impact on people choosing to enlist. This is obviously the case broadly, but we definitely see it with Indigenous communities where brothers will enlist to look after brothers, uncles will enlist to look after nephews, fathers will sometimes even enlist to look after sons. And so we do really see kinship ties. Obviously, Salo, 6 of his brothers also enlisted. They all enlisted at the same time. So it's very, very common for large family groups to enlist. And when you apply that to an island, although the Torres Strait Islands are quite large, only a very small number of them are populated. And those communities, particularly in the 1930s, 1940s, before colonial Australia had fully reached there, were very tight-knit communities. And so there very much was a view of not only needing to go and do your bit to protect your home, but also to go and support and serve your family and uphold that warrior tradition that's such an important part of the Torres Strait identity. It's also worth noting that the Torres Strait Islands really were the last barrier between the Japanese Empire in the South Pacific and the Australian mainland. And although we now know that the Japanese never had any intention of invading Australia, that was a very real fear. Darwin was bombed during the fall of the Southwest Pacific. Japanese submarines made it as far south as Melbourne and the South Coast. There were attacks on Sydney Harbour. So it was a very real fear that Japan would invade. And the Torres Strait was very much recognised by the Australian government, by the Australian military authorities, and also by the American authorities that were in Australia as being the last port of defence. And that wasn't lost on the Torres Strait Islanders. They were very aware that if an invasion came, it would likely come through them, and their communities didn't have the resources and the support to be defended. And so men enlisted to help defend their home, both Australia more broadly, but also specifically the islands that they'd been born and raised on.
And I suppose it wouldn't be remiss to think that the service personnel, particularly the white service personnel that were attempting to sort of leverage those community members into enlistment, right, were certainly capable and willing to leverage, whether it was connection to community, the strategic priority of the region, the familial connection that encouraged, right, family members to enlist together. I'm sure that was not lost on them in some of the strategy.
No, absolutely not. And we do see that in most of the special units that are formed. The people, at least the commanding officers who initially formed them, have a very strong awareness of traditional communities, of traditions, of culture, and of the relationship of kinship ties, and absolutely use that in their enlistment, sometimes genuinely very well-meaning, other times slightly more coercively.
Sure. I have another one. In what way, if at all, has the Australian War Memorial maybe evolved in its mission from collecting, distributing, sharing, and educating to serving as advocates in the pursuit of reconstructing these stories and leveraging those stories as an opportunity to, as you said, sort of late in your talk about recovering these histories and sort of attempting to repair any damage? Is the museum space sort of taking a role in any of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the memorial is a very old institution, and we're also governed by a government act, which impacts. It basically lays out that our role is we're a museum, an archive, and a shrine, and our role is to protect, but also to disseminate and share information about Australian military service. And that very much includes aspects of Australian military service that in the 1940s, in the 1950s, weren't given full attention. Since 2015, in particular, the memorial has done a lot of work around recognising Indigenous military service and working really closely with communities to help tell these stories in a way that is respectful to the community and their needs, and also enables us to act as a safe place and a safekeeping place for these stories. So it's something that we very much believe in and is very much part of our mission. And it's a real privilege to be involved in that from the historical side rather than as a curator or as a liaison with the community, but to be able to delve into this history and share it with audiences, whether that be through written forms or through talks, both like this one online or talks in the galleries, talks to members of the public, to help make sure that this information is known and to encourage communities to come forward and share their stories with us and to know that they can trust us with their stories.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Any other questions? Okay, well, Rachel, thank you again so much. I mean, really, between the time zone change and what have got to be some magnanimous responsibilities of yours, we're certainly grateful and appreciative of the time. And thank you for sharing all of the artifacts. I have one last question. What didn't make the cut in the article that you shared with us today that you always know that you have to pay some attention to?
So in the article, I talked about Pat's embroidery, but not his incredible collection of sketches. That was very practically, at that point, we hadn't digitized his sketchbook. And so pulling the images for the article was not practical. It was actually in our digitization lab as I was writing and submitting the article. So it's great to be able to share some of that because I love his embroidery, but I love his sketches. I just think they're beautiful and they're so special and so filled with life and personality. But I also didn't have an opportunity to talk about David Valentine Paul or Reg Saunders and their objects. So it's really great to be able to share some of those as well. And it's particularly special because Flight Lieutenant Paul's uniform is on display in our galleries. So people can come and read his story and see his actual uniform. We also have his medals. We have lots of other objects relating to him. So it was really great to be able to share that in this kind of public space as well. But I'm sure the longer I was left alone with our collection, the more stories I'd pull out and think I had to tell them.
Certainly.
So I'm sure there'll be a part 2 at some point down the line.
You just let us know and you can come back. Absolutely. Well, thank you again. We appreciate you on behalf of Veteran Studies Association. Thank you. And for those of you who maybe missed the live talk, this is going to be recorded and hosted on our YouTube channel. And so we'll be able to share these stories far and wide through our membership. So thank you. Thank you again so much. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We appreciate you all so much and go forward and take care.
Awesome. Thank
Thanks
you.
so much, Amber.
Bye-bye.